Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 K-State Garden Hour series. If this is your first time with us, welcome. If you're a regular, we're happy to have you joining again. We started this webinar in the spring of 2020 as a way to share extension gardening education during COVID, and with much success, we've continued into 2021. This webinar is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Cassie Homan, and I'm the horticulture agent in the Post Rock District. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture education or a related discipline, but most of all, we each have a love for gardening and sharing important gardening topics. I love that these webinars have brought gardeners from all over the state of Kansas together to learn and grow and share our gardening passion. So before we get started, we do have a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. Please make sure to use the Q&A feature for questions related to the presentation. That's a little button down at the bottom of the screen, the Q&A. This is where we'll look for your questions, and at the end of the presentation, we'll have a session for question and answers. Just click that button and enter in your question so we can answer all the questions you have today. Our moderators are Dennis Patton and Sharon Ashworth, and they will be sharing information through the chat during the presentation. They will also help us facilitate the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar will be recorded and we'll post it to the K-State Garden Hour website. We typically upload additional resources that's related to the topic as well. If we share any links through the chat, we'll also put them on that website for you. Our website is also where you'll find previous topics and upcoming topics for the 2021 series. Our moderator will send the link for that over the chat. So today's topic is native plants to support native bees. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Jason Graves. Jason is the horticulture agent in the Central Kansas District. So if you'll give us a few moments, we'll transition and show the slides.
All right, thanks, Cassie. We're going to share screen here. Okay. Hopefully that is working.
Looks good.
All right. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Yeah, it's going to be, as Cassie mentioned, we're talking pollinators today, and it's good timing because next week is National Pollinator Week. And so it's good timing to refresh our knowledge and to maybe learn something new even today, hopefully, about pollinators. Here in the Central Kansas District, it's a nice hot day, and I've been out in the mornings here lately, kind of watching for a lot of our native pollinators, and a lot of plants blooming here recently has certainly attracted them, and so it's been fun to be getting ready for this topic and kind of being aware of the bees that are out there. So we're going to talk native plants to support native bees. We're going to jump in. We've got a lot of slides, so I'm going to try to use my time wisely as much as I can. So our objectives today, we're going to focus on, kind of three primary objectives. One, just to review the importance of pollinators, how they connect to human health and well-being. There's a direct connection. And so we want to be aware of that. And it encourages us, when we understand them, to want to support pollinators. We want to talk a little bit about native bee pollinators and just some of the characteristics of our native bees, and also what makes a flower pollinator friendly. We're going to cover that a little bit. And then we're going to jump into some plants. We're all interested in plants, and maybe finding a new plant or two that we can learn about to increase pollinator habitat, support pollinators in our backyards. So without any more introduction, we're going to jump right in here. So pollinators are a keystone species, and that's the way I like to talk about them when I teach anything about pollinators. We always talk about the keystone species that they are, because they really are the center of a thriving and a well-functioning ecosystem. And we call them a keystone species because the survival of very large numbers of other species depends on pollinators. Even our survival is connected to pollinators. So they're essential. And that's why it's good to be able to highlight them and bring awareness to the ecosystem services they provide, which we'll look at here in just a second. So why do we need them? Of course, some of these stats you may have seen before if you've read anything about pollinators, but 80% of flowering plants on the planet rely on insect or animal mediated pollination to reproduce. And of course, that's a key statistic that helps us understand why we need pollinators. Talk about food webs and ecosystems that depend on those pollinators. And also the food, you've heard that statistic, I'm sure 1/3 of the world's food crop production relies on pollination. And so that's a huge value in our lives that pollinators bring. But, I like to use this word biodiversity a lot as well when we talk about pollinators, because we use this word because it refers really to life. Biodiversity is just that kind of big scientific word for how much life is around us, right? And biodiversity is the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. And so pollinators are basically, they're directly responsible for providing the biodiversity that really helps our environment function. And so you think about pollinators and how they're directly connected to our food, our water, our air quality, our medicines, our mental and physical health, our recreation. You can look at some of the things on this diagram and just see how many areas pollinators impact. And so the value is immense. And that's another reason we call them a keystone species. Biodiversity, frankly, keeps us human beings healthy and alive. And that's why I want to highlight that direct connection that pollinators have to human health and well-being. If you get interested, you can go look at a study that was done in 2018 that actually basically concluded that humans actually have a basic psychological need for nature relatedness. And, we have to have nature in our lives for our health and well-being. And pollinators, of course, come into that picture. Now, I want to highlight the decline in biodiversity. A lot of us have read or heard about this, but we are seeing biodiversity declines around us. And so that's a thing to highlight, just to encourage us to want to participate in developing a pollinator habitat or being a part of reclaiming some of what we need to support pollinators. There's a couple of studies you could look at if you're interested. I'm not going to go into these in depth, just want to highlight Rosenberg back in 2019 did release some study on the decline in our songbird population. So if you want to look that up, you can learn about some of the declines there. There's also studies you can refer to for declines in bumblebees, of course, one of our native pollinators that we're concerned with. And so, you can look up studies online that have researched this and are kind of documenting some of the declines in biodiversity. I want to highlight that biodiversity actually comes from plants. And for us gardeners, that is really encouraging because we love plants. If you're like me, you're always trying to sneak one more into the backyard somewhere. And the neat thing about that is when we talk about pollinator habitat, we're talking about just planting more plants. And, we're going to talk about native plants because native plants have history and connection to our pollinators. And that's important because we want plants that interact, right, with our pollinators, that provide for their needs. So we typically talk about native plants being the plants that do that the best. But the idea is that life comes from biodiversity. Plants are basically determining the carrying capacity for any space. And so the more plants we can get in a space with the more diversity, the more life we can support. And when we talk about pollinators, habitat is an urgent need. And that's one of the things we're going to highlight as we go through this presentation. Excuse me. So we wanted to think about how can we be participants in reclaiming, building more habitat for pollinators, because as you know, land use has changed quite dramatically. Over the past decades, we've lost a lot of our natural areas where we would have normally, historically had a lot of habitat out there for pollinators. And so we just want to bring awareness to, if you leave here today, one thing you hopefully will know is that habitat is an urgent need for our pollinators. And habitat for pollinators really, basically we're looking at three things when we talk about habitat for pollinators. We need food, right? Just like we do, human beings, which will consist of a diversity of plants, preferably, like we said, we're going to focus on native plants, but it's not limited to just natives. We need nesting and egg laying sites for our pollinators. That's part of habitat. We also need overwintering habitat. So, habitat plays a lot of function, of course, in whether our pollinators are going to be supported and able to thrive in our backyards and cities and, across the globe. So I also want to highlight that we need pesticide-free habitat. That's another thing to consider as you think about pollinators. And so I'm going to highlight, we do have a publication, K-State publication that highlights, some of the questions people have about pesticides and bees, and I'll highlight that later. But just to highlight that we need pesticide-free habitat, that's also important to understand. This diagram is neat. I like it because it highlights, as we get into some of the characteristics of native bees, what we're going to realize is that their habitat varies. They're kind of all over the place. You'll find our native bees nesting in, stumps and tree snags and wood. You'll find them nesting in the ground. You're going to find that these pollinators are using all kinds of habitat. And so that's just important to realize. And I think this diagram kind of highlights that idea, communicates that well. Bumblebees are a unique, for me, bumblebees highlight the habitat need, the need for habitat quite well, because bumblebees actually require, of all of our native bees, require more habitat than about any other type of native bee, because they have a distinct life cycle that requires three different types of habitat. Bumblebees require food, of course. They've got to have floral resources, but they also need nesting habitat during the season and overwintering habitat specifically for the queen bee, which is the only one that overwinters. And so when we talk about habitat, if you're interested in studying about our bumblebees, you'll find there's some interesting ways that we might be able to support bumblebees a little bit better with some of our practices. And the Xerces Society certainly has some nice resources on those. We're not going to go into it in depth here today, but I just wanted to highlight that when we talk about habitat, bumblebees certainly come to mind as one of our native bees that we can really do a better job of supporting as we learn more about those. So let's jump in a little more specifically to some of the pollinator topic we want to hit today. I just want to review pollination really quick, which is simply just what happens during the event of pollination is simply the movement of the pollen, right? Which is the male gametes in the plant to the female part of the plant, the pistil. And so we have a lot of insects that are visiting flowers. Not all of them are necessarily pollinators, but this is the process that we're talking about, the pollination process, which is moving that pollen to the pistil and allowing that plant to form a seed, right, and to reproduce. And so this is the process that we're talking about. And our pollinators, when we think about who they are, obviously we're familiar with the European honeybee. That's probably one that many people think of when we think of pollinators, but we've also got other pollinators such as our native bees, which we're going to highlight today, butterflies, moths, flies. Certain animals can be pollinators. And so you'll find various ways that plants accomplish that pollination process. But I want to highlight native bees because they are really, when we talk about pollinators, they're certainly the workhorses that get a lot of the pollination done out there across the globe. And so when we talk about bees, we're talking about they really are the most efficient pollinators simply because they're the only animals that purposefully collect pollen. And so that pollen is used by bees as a protein source to reproduce, fed to the immature bees. And so that's what makes them really good pollinators, because they are in search of and collecting pollen. And in that process, they're moving the pollen across those flowers. And so, of course, they're also collecting nectar. We're going to hit on that as well as we delve into what makes a pollinator-friendly flower. So as far as our native bees, which is where I want to spend a little more time here today with you, we want to highlight there's over 4,000 species of native bees in the United States. And I think that's sometimes a fascinating statistic that folks realize as they get into learning about pollinators. But in Kansas here, our best estimates, probably we have about maybe 400 species. And so, of course, these are very valuable crop pollinators. They do a lot of pollination, and they're active. Certain pollinators can be active even when weather isn't optimum. Our native pollinators. And of course, we've already talked about many of the benefits they provide. So, here in these pictures, you can see we've got our bumblebee, we've got a sweat bee, we've got a metallic sweat bee, the nice little green coloration to that one. We've got mason bees, leafcutter bees. We've got all kinds of native bees that are going to be active out in our landscapes when we start to, in our homes and gardens, when we start to create the habitat necessary for their survival. Now, a few characteristics of native bees that I'd like to communicate just so that, we understand these are different than the European honeybee, right? And so we want to, I understand that native bees are solitary primarily, meaning they are not social. So they're typically, the majority of our native bees are not gathering in groups. The one exception is bumblebees. I mean, bumblebees do create colonies, annual colonies. And so they do form some social groups together around a queen, a bumblebee. But for the vast majority of our native bees, they are solitary and they're not aggressive. That's the one thing I always like to talk about with kids as well is, we don't need to be afraid. We see these native bees out working on the flowers. It's a lot of fun to watch them, and we don't need to be afraid of them because they're not after us. They're not aggressive. And typically we like to think about that habitat. Like we said, 70% of native bees are going to be ground nesting bees. And so they're actually nesting in the ground, which is interesting. 30% of them nest in plant stems. And that's, like we said, that's another form of habitat we want to provide. Not only flowers, for food, but we also need that nesting habitat. And so we want to protect habitat and be aware of that and where they're living in our landscapes. Now, native bees, we highlight the 70% that nest in the ground. I also want to highlight the stem nesters because 30% are using our plants to nest in. They're not only using them for food, they're using them for nesting material. To either, build a nest or, reproduce in those plant stems. Famous example would be our leafcutter bees. And so these are really neat bees. This picture here, you can see where the little C shapes are cut out of the leaves. It's a picture I snapped of buttonbush here in a garden locally where the leafcutter bees have been harvesting that leaf material to put in their nest. And you can kind of see a snapshot of a nesting bee and how they use that material there on the bottom of this slide. And I think it's really neat to think that we get to share our plants, not just pollen and nectar. We get to share the leaves, the plant parts with these bees as well. This is a European wool carder bee that I snapped a photo of on some motherwort because this is another leaf. This is a member of the leafcutter bee family as well, and it's harvesting plant hairs. So it's not harvesting the leaf necessarily, but it's harvesting the trichomes, the hairs off of this motherwort plant, and it's going to line its nest with those materials. And so, these bees are out there in our landscapes utilizing what's available, right, to reproduce. And so, just to go back to what we're highlighting here. Today is this habitat loss and forage loss are really the two critical things we want to consider. If you could take away one thing from this presentation, we want to make clear that one of the most important things that we can do as gardeners is to create and provide habitat in all its forms for pollinators. And so let's jump into what bees need, right? So we need to think about what do they need if we're going to create this habitat. So obviously the things we need to be aware of that are very important are the pollen and nectar. These are the two primary things when we think of habitat, bees must have. Our native bees have got to have pollen and nectar all season. And a typical adult native bee may only be active for 2 to 6 weeks, during the year. So if that's a portion where portion of time where in your landscape for a couple of weeks, there's nothing in bloom, boy, they have a famine and they may not be able to reproduce. And so we want to focus on pollen and nectar. Bees are also collecting oils and resins. I'm not going to go into this in depth. I just want to mention it because it's as those native bees are out on our flowers, they're not just collecting pollen and nectar, they're also collecting oils and resins and plant various uses, because it may be medicinal, antimicrobial for the larvae. A lot of it's for waterproofing their nests. So there's also other needs that bees have. And so a diversity of plants is essential so that they can meet the various needs that they have to reproduce. Now, what makes a flower attractive to bees? Or when we talk about flowers, I want to just delve into this a little bit. Typically flowers that are attractive to bees are going to be kind of in the ultraviolet color range, because that's where bees actually see. And so we're thinking in the colors, white, yellow, blue, purple, violet. Typically red colors are not the greatest because they don't see those well. Although if a bee stumbles upon, like a red bee balm or something, they're still going to utilize it. It may just be not as visible to them. So, the color can be important. Fragrance is often an important part of how bees are attracted to flowers as well. So, you're going to find a lot of pollinator plants do have a fragrance associated with them. That's kind of a way to communicate with bees. Hey, we're here, come find us and do the pollination. So that's one of the ways plants reach out to the bees, in essence, is with a fragrance. We typically are looking for flowers that are going to be obviously open during the daytime. That's going to be important when bees are active. And the shape of flowers has an important part to play. So you think of the various shapes we see, whether it's a coneflower shape, a tubular shape, small flowers. We're going to look at a couple of those here that work well for bees. So the coneflower shape is probably one of the most common that folks are familiar with. Think of our purple coneflower, black-eyed Susans. We have a lot of flowers that maintain this shape, and it works well for bees, right? And so that's just something we notice as we observe pollinators. This flower shape works well for them, and there's a lot of options we can look at that flowers that have this shape. Shallow tubular flowers are also work well. I think of our penstemon and legumes like our baptisia. These also work well for bees, and so you're going to find different plants have different styles of blooms, but this is one that works well for bees. You're going to see in some of the plants we look at. Lots of small flowers. This is great for bees as well. Think of our Joe Pye weed, goldenrod, agastache. I mean, all the different flowers that we may utilize in a landscape setting. That the form they take is just lots of little small flowers, and this is also a good form of flower for our bees, our native bees. And you can see here, this is a picture I took of a Valerian plant in my garden, and you see this little sweat bee crawling over this thing, and so you got all these little flowers just clustered on top. And boy, that bee was just having a great time, obviously finding lots of pollen and nectar on top of those small little flowers. Plants with many small flowers also attract beneficial insects, and that's another thing that we tend to see is that, like we said, those goldenrods, Joe Pye weeds, some of these plants that flower in that form tend to attract a lot of our beneficials as well, such as this hoverfly, which is an adult as an adult is a pollinator, but as a larva is a voracious aphid eater. And so, if you have these hoverflies, if you can draw them in, you're going to be drawing in beneficial insect control into your home and garden landscape. So Here's another example of my Valerian plant with the hoverfly on there. So I was happy to see that because I knew, boy, there must be some larvae around here somewhere. Then hopefully they're going to consume some aphids as well. Now, when we talk about what makes the plant pollinator friendly, we've already talked some about the flower form and the color and the fragrance and different things. Now, we want to really highlight pollen and nectar because obviously we're all familiar with this, but pollen and nectar is really the key, really the number one need for our native pollinators. We need an ample supply of easily accessible pollen and nectar. And so obviously we don't want it to be contaminated with pesticide, which is why we talked about, we highlighted pesticide-free habitat. But these are the two resources bees are after primarily. And so these are the things we want to be able to provide. Now, pollen is protein, right? So that's what bees are utilizing pollen for. It's a protein that is essential for bee reproduction. And so that's why they're collecting it. They're mixing it with pollen, with nectar, and they're actually storing it in their nests, right? As a diet for the larval bees. And so pollen is essential to bee reproduction. So we've got to provide pollen. There's a lot of variation in pollen types, and you can research that and find how unique pollen is across the plant world. And that's why we get specialized bees that on occasion specialize on certain plants and plant pollen. Of course, nectar, we need fuel. So nectar is the carbohydrates primarily that bees are using as adults. And some of that in social bees, in the honeybees goes into the honey as well. But the nectar primarily, we're thinking of fuel for these adult bees to keep, working and reproducing. So we want plants that produce nectar to make nectar readily available for our native bees. Sometimes we get questions, or I do, on, do all plants produce pollen and nectar? Well, no, not necessarily. As you all may know, we have, a common weed like ragweed can be a good example of a plant that doesn't produce nectar. It's a wind pollinated plant. And so typically that's why, people have problems with allergies, is because there are certain plants that release copious amounts of this pollen to the wind in hopes that it randomly just pollinates, right, the other plants. And so there are plants that are just producing and releasing pollen. And generally our wind pollinated plants are not there's not a real valuable pollen source for bees. They will use it if they're in dire need of something at times, but generally the plants that produce that are wind pollinated are not necessarily our best for bees. So some flowers are bred to be pollenless. I do want to mention this because if you look into sunflowers, that's one thing you're going to find is that some of the varieties used for, typically have been developed to not have the pollen so that they can be used for, events and to put in bouquets and things like that, where they don't shed that pollen everywhere. And so you want to be aware that you're not using varieties that have been bred more for cut flowers, those sorts of things, because in some cases they're breeding to reduce the pollen. They're actually limiting that so that the flower can be used for another purpose. So in our sunflowers, we now have sunflowers, cultivars that are pollenless, which of course is not going to support our native pollinators. Some breeding in plants, some of the hydrangeas is a good example of how our native hydrangeas have been changed pretty dramatically as well, as far as how their flowers appear. And so, a native hydrangea typically has a couple sterile flowers, as you can see in this photo, a couple of these white sterile flowers just scattered around the hydrangea. And then the actual flower parts that produce pollen and nectar are in the middle. There are a lot of those small flowers like we were talking about. Whereas some of the cultivated varieties of hydrangea have been selected to produce the showy sterile flowers only. And so, you got to do your research on plants and be aware that, you want to find plants that are actually going to support the bees if that's what you're after. And some of them are certainly better at that than others. I like to highlight coneflower. It makes for a good example. We talk about it can really be a good idea to focus if you're developing pollinator habitat on the species, the original species of the plant that you're after, because coneflower is a good example because, we've got varieties, as you can see up here in the corner, of color changes in plants that may not be attractive to bees, where a coneflower has been bred to have more of this green, kind of a whitish color that's not going to be as attractive to our pollinators. Or in the case of this Double Delight variety, cultivated coneflower, we've got, it's not accessible to pollinators. So we're having an issue there where pollinators have a hard time getting access to the plant parts that make it effective as a pollinator plant. And so the species, just the general species of coneflower, the old-fashioned single varieties are typically the best for our pollinators. I will say sometimes folks, sometimes it's hard to determine is a plant, has a cultivated variety been changed too much? And you're just going to have to research your plants because, this variety Magnus of coneflower is a variety that's been selected to be basically just a shorter, more compact variety, but overall, there's not much else that has changed in that plant. And so, of course, we would expect that Magnus, a shorter variety that still has the color and the shape, would still be a good pollinator plant. So there may be cases where selections of plants are still going to be very viable as cultivars, but it's always good to do your research and learn about the plants and the cultivars that you're selecting. Okay, so planting for pollinators. I'm not going to develop too much. I want to get to some plants here, so we're going to have to speed along. But I like to highlight the rule of 3 when we talk about planting for pollinators because it's just easy to remember. And so what we can highlight is that we can plant for all 3 seasons. Like we said, nectar and pollen available season long in our pollinator habitat. And so we want to plant for 3 seasons, spring to fall. And our aim is to have at least 3 different species in bloom each season. So that's a good goal to shoot for. And then we'd like to plant in groups. So at least 3 varieties, at least 3 of each variety. So, if you're looking for just a general formula to start with, this rule of 3 may be helpful because it just gets you on your way. We're trying to, like we said, avoid a feast or famine scenario for our pollinators, where we've got something in bloom for a short period of time all at once, and then a big gap with nothing in bloom. So we want to avoid feast and famine, and that's why we promote this rule of 3, just as a way to think about that. And you can see here, this was a picture I snapped in our demonstration garden of yarrow, salvia, and some ragwort that's blooming all at once. And we've got enough of a mass of each that, that's a good example, I guess, of what that might look like. It also looks nice in a landscape. So when we plant for pollinators, we're also talking about sunny areas. Primarily, that's where we get the most flowers. Now, we're going to highlight a couple plants that, you can do that may not necessarily need full sun either. But insects, need to be warmed by the sun, and there's generally more blooms in the sun. So my advice is just get to know your site. And, ideally, regardless of what your site is, there's going to be native plants that fit into it, and we can find varieties that we can plant. So, but just in general, be aware of that. In the sun is a lot of times preferred because we can grow a lot of plants that are going to support our pollinators. I want to highlight our website that Sharon Ashworth has put together. I think this is a great resource. Everybody should check out plantnativekansas.weebly.com. So if you're looking to establish native plants anywhere in any setting, this is a good resource for you here, at least in Kansas, to use. And so I'd encourage you to check this out to gain some knowledge on it's a real thorough resource for you on how to establish and go about utilizing native plants. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to be pressed for time to get through these. So I'm going to go quickly, and we're going to talk about some plants that you may want to consider, like we said, for that pollinator habitat that's so urgently needed. Now, this is a lot of gardeners don't like to hear this necessarily, but spring weeds, we're going to kind of focus spring through fall here. Spring weeds can provide a valuable source of early forage habitat. And, you know, we're all going to have weeds. These aren't going away. So at times it's just something I like to highlight to say this might be a way you can support pollinators to tolerate a few more weeds. It's just, I just like to draw an awareness to that. You will see pollinators using dandelions, clover, henbit. Some of these weeds we try to eradicate a lot of times. If we can tolerate some in our pollinator habitat, that will be beneficial. And so I like to highlight that as we talk about springtime. A lot of folks are familiar with Baptisia, which is a great plant for pollinator land, for spring pollinator support. The full sun plant typically, you know, can get pretty good size if once it gets established. The key to this plant is it's slow to establish. So you gotta have some patience, but we've used this plant a lot in our gardens around. I've seen it in a lot of gardens around Salina, and it does really well. Once it's established, it's very long lived, but it's a slow starter. But I see bumblebees on it all the time. That's primarily why I really enjoy it, because it seems to draw in those bumblebees a lot. So consider using that in your spring planting. The Columbine is another one that we focus on in spring. It's another good one that's really adaptable, shade or sun. A lot of times it can tolerate both, at least the species. And so a lot of times you'll also see things like hummingbirds and various other, I guess, users of this plant as well in the landscape. So it's a fun one to highlight, and it's pretty easy to grow. Sometimes it can be a little bit short-lived, but it does reseed itself and it'll come back. Blue Star is one, this Amsonia, that you'll see on a lot of plant lists that is a good spring bloomer for bees as well. And so a lot of times it's one we highlight and ask people to consider, because it also has that color that bees like, kind of in that ultraviolet blue range. So you'll see bees, you know, being attracted to it. And it tolerates, it's fairly adaptable as well. When you're talking about sun to part shade, it gives you some options, you know, in a pollinator habitat to locate it and to have, you know, I guess some flexibility with a plant that maybe can fit into multiple scenarios. So Blue Star is one we like to highlight for spring pollinator habitat. I want to bring your attention to figwort as well. This is kind of one that was a little bit newer to me. And so if you haven't heard of figwort, I would highly suggest looking into it, because it is a prolific nectar producer. And that is, like we said, that is one of those key things that we're looking for our pollinators is nectar. And figwort is just actually used to be just, there's a couple varieties that you can find. You may have to do some searching for it because it's not necessarily horticulturally a real beautiful plant, but if you're a horticulturist, you'll still appreciate it because the flowers are small and it's unique to look at up close. But it's an adaptable plant. Again, for those who are dealing with shade, might be a good option to look at. Tolerates medium to moist soil. There's two varieties, the lance-leaved figwort and the Maryland figwort. Those two varieties bloom. There's one that blooms early and one that blooms late. And like I said, these are prolific nectar producers, and you are going to see more bees and pollinators than you've ever seen with figwort, just because of how much nectar it produces. And the sugar concentration ranges anywhere from 18 to 55 or 35% with our figworts. And so just want to highlight that plant, maybe pique your interest if you haven't heard of it, something new to try. Bee balm, of course, is a well-known plant and wonderful for our pollinators, and there's lots of varieties available. So some of the bee balms are blooming now, some will be blooming here soon. So you're going to find a lot of variety within the bee balms. And when we talk about summertime, this is a great summer bloomer that we can work in that system, you know, to have blooms throughout the season. So bee balm is a wonderful plant you can look at. Anise Hyssop, Agastaki is a great plant for pollinators. Some of our folks, they get frustrated with this plant because it can spread a little bit. It can kind of be, you kind of have to do a little work with it sometimes, but it still is one of our best pollinator plants. And the Anise Hyssop, which grows across the U.S. in various places, it tolerates, again, is adaptable. So you've got sun to part shade, dry to fairly moist soil. It needs well-drained soil. But again, you're getting that summertime bloom, and like we talked about, a mass of small flowers, which is just on those little flower heads, which is great for bees. I mean, they love it. And so you'll see over 40% sugar concentration in the nectar on this plant, which makes it just really just a powerhouse plant for our bees, native bees. Ironweed, this is another one that you're going to enjoy if you can get it established. It's a lot of varieties of ironweed, so you have to do your research and look it up. Kind of blooms in the summer. There's varieties that typically can grow in different types of sites, wet or dry. And so, you want to do your research. But this plant there's a specialist bee on this plant that I think is kind of neat. It's the longhorned bees. And so there's a group of bees we refer to as longhorn bees that specialize on the pollen of this plant. And like we said, when you plant it, that's the bee you're going to be, in addition to supporting lots of other bees, you're going to support some of these specialist native bees. And ironweed happens to support some of these longhorn bees, which may be a unique one you can draw into your landscape. Blazing Star, a lot of folks are familiar with this one. Of course, it's getting ready to bloom now, at least here in Salina. Just the blooms are just beginning. And so, it's going to be a great summer addition as well. Gives you kind of an upright form. Sometimes you do have to stake these. They can get a little bit floppy at times. There's some varieties and cultivars that are a little shorter that may be useful, but it tolerates, again, it's full sun. Going to prefer dry to moist soil, probably more medium, appreciate a little bit of moisture here and there. But another wonderful plant for pollinators. It supports this really unique moth that you can see here as well, called a bleeding flower moth. So this is a specialist moth that's associated with our blazing star that you might find yourself seeing on these plants, and it'd be kind of a fun find if you can do that. Prairie Clover. So this is another plant that it really has declined because of, it's a little bit of a slower growing plant. It's eagerly eaten by a lot of wildlife, livestock, rabbits, everything. So, but frankly, we need more of it because it is a great pollinator plant. Yeah, it's long blooming and it's really highly preferred by bees. They will seek this out if it's there. Above a lot of other plants. And so there's some Bumble Bees that really specialize on Prairie Clover. And so you can see also this polyester bee that's a ground nester that's a specialist on Prairie Clover. So highly encourage you to work on this. It's a little bit tricky. It takes a while to get it going, but if you can do it, you're going to be well rewarded with the Prairie Clover. Rattlesnake Master, this Eringo, various pollinators are attracted to this plant, and it's a really neat one. This Rattlesnake Master, you'll see it a lot of times. It's a pretty striking foliage, as well, which makes it a unique addition to a landscape. The white plant you see here is the Rattlesnake Master. The purple one is actually Leavenworth Eringo, which is that's actually an annual. And so this is a plant that you can establish from seed in the fall. And, it puts a ton of energy into these blooms. And so you'll have a fantastic show, not only of color with this one, but you'll just see it swarmed with pollinators. So this is a great one to look at, for various use in a pollinator habitat for summer blooms as well. Milkweed. I want to, bring, of course, we're familiar with milkweed, and there's milkweeds that grow about in every type of soil type and condition, it seems. So we like to highlight milkweed. They really have, they're nectar producers, and so they're definitely good for all kinds of pollinators. They're a little bit unique, though. I like to share this with people that milkweed handle their pollen differently. And so they actually don't have free and loose pollen. Milkweed actually gather their pollen into these waxy little sacs called pollinia. And so pollinators typically, when they visit this plant, the way the pollen is spread is they actually can't really collect this pollen. So it's not necessarily a plant that's supporting insects, a lot of our bees, with pollen, but the pollen actually sticks to their legs in these sacs as they visit the plant, and then it's transferred, across as they visit the blooms. So I think that's an interesting feature of milkweed. It's kind of interesting to me because, a lot of times that was just something I hadn't put together, that, milkweeds don't have that free and loose pollen like a lot of other plants do. So just something, kind of a trivia there for you. Silphiums, these are wonderful plants for if you've got a lot of space, of course. These are really big. We're familiar with compass plant, cut plants. A lot of these are really large. So if you got some space, go for it. It'd be a wonderful plant to put in. Again, they're going to take some time to get established because they really develop deep tap roots. And so, as we let them establish, we're going to be rewarded over time with more and more blooms. And, these are host plants. They're pollinator plants. They provide a lot of nesting material for our native bees, like we talked about, that need those stems and different things. And so Silphium is a wonderful group of plants to look into to support native pollinators. In case you didn't know it, the Land Institute, I got to mention this just because I'm right here in Salina, is actually domesticating some of the Silphium. And so if you're interested in this plant, you can check out the Land Institute's work with domesticating this plant for other uses, for perennial uses. And we're realizing it's a very valuable plant for a lot of reasons. So I find it intriguing to let people know of some of the work that's going on with it. Penstemon, I love to watch the bees. With this one, these two pictures, I was able to snap here recently, where you got these bumblebees are just taking a deep dive. If you can see the arrows here that are pointing to the bee, just diving right in that tubular flower. It's fascinating to watch. I just sat there and watched that for a while because it was just kind of a neat to see how passionate these bees are about getting in there when there's a reward to be found, right? So they're taking a dive into the flower. But our penstemon has a nice sugar concentration as well. A lot of times 37% sugar in the nectar. So it's a good reward for our bees. There's various penstemon you can use in landscape settings. Coneflower, we've already mentioned. A lot of folks are familiar with that, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But again, bees, when we see them on coneflower, it's very common to find bees with full pollen sacs. And so it's pretty apparent that coneflower is a really important part of bee nutrition and the diet of a lot of our native bees. Sunflower, we're all familiar with the famous sunflowers that we have here in Kansas. We're looking forward to those blooming here later. And so, of course, they're very adaptable. You can find sunflowers for all kinds of different sites. And so if you do your research, you'll find a lot of varieties that you could use in different settings. And so they're diverse, they're widespread natives that are adaptable and attract a tremendous variety of insects, as well as provide seed for, birds and other wildlife later in the year. So, great sugar concentration in the nectar. I mean, there's just so many positives about sunflowers. That's why we kind of refer to them as a food hub. We've got the rigid sunflower, just to highlight a couple different ones. We've got Maximilian sunflower. We've got willow leaf sunflower. You're going to find lots of different sunflowers you can look at. For those who are into edibles, you can also do the Jerusalem artichoke, which is a kind of a, one of those plants that maybe benefits us as well if we consume some of the root there. So, but it's a member of the sunflower family, has a lot of pollinator benefits as well. I want to highlight mountain mints because these are a lot of times underutilized. And so these are native plants that are native to North America. They do spread by rhizomes, not as aggressively as the herb mint, but you do have to watch them and work with them. But these are some of the best pollinator plants as well. There's multiple varieties of mountain mints. We refer to them kind of as pycnanthemum. It's the scientific name for these, but if you can look into mountain mints, you'll be well rewarded by adding these to your pollinator habitat. They are super pollinator plants, all of them. And so typically in that late summer to early fall, when we're starting to look for something to fill the gaps, this plant really can fit in well. And so that's one I've been encouraging folks to look at more and more and utilizing in landscapes, not only because they're just a good plant that can adapt to various sites as well, whether you got some shade or sun, you can usually work them in. Joe Pye weed, another one we mentioned earlier, has that top of a mass of small flowers, really good for butterflies, but also bees as well. And so you're gonna need some moist soil for this one typically. So you, again, like we said, you want to research your site and know where your plant, what you need, because certain plants are going to have requirements. And this, one of the requirements of Joe Pye is going to be a little bit more of a moist site where we're going to be able to have some moisture available. Goldenrod, as we get ready to kind of finish up here, goldenrod is a fall bloomer that is essential for pollinators. This has got to be in your pollinator habitat, because this is a plant that our bees are using constantly in the fall to prepare for that wintering, that overwintering. And so a lot of bees are collecting this and storing it in their nests, or using it as winter preparations for that next generation. So again, there's lots of varieties, different types of goldenrod you can use. So do your research, but certainly include it, because it's one of the best fall bloomers in a time of year where pollinators need support. This is a key one. And then also our asters are very important to consider, because they're in the same season, a little late in the fall there. They're going to be blooming, and we're going to get, again, great nectar on these plants, on our asters. There's lots of species to choose from. So, you need to do your research, because again, you're going to find some that fit more in more of a wet site, more of a shady site, more of a dry site. So you're going to need to look at the varieties and choose one accordingly to your site. Before we end, I just want to highlight those who do gardening. A lot of times are herbs. I can't spend much time on this, but I do want to highlight that herbs are wonderful pollinator plants. And you can plant some of these annual herbs like basil, coriander, dill in a strip in your garden and really support pollinators. So consider doing things, maybe if you don't have, maybe you're doing vegetables, you can still support pollinators, by utilizing herbs. Oregano is an amazing plant. I will say it's one of the highest rated plants for its sugar concentration. So I like to mention that, because sometimes, that's a plant we can utilize as well. And if you do, you'll be well rewarded, because it's a plant that is going to facilitate a lot of pollinators. And so I think in the essence of time here, I have more plants, but we're not going to be able to get to them. I want to invite at least a few questions here. So I'm going to stop there and invite Cassie or Dennis here to fire away if we have a few maybe questions we can tackle.
I've already answered over 13 questions, but I saved some really good broad spectrum questions for you.
Okay, excellent.
So the first one is, in the spring, when can we safely clean up the garden for the bees and overwintering stages?
Okay, certainly. Yeah, for bees, a lot of times I like to wait till the temperatures consistently reach at least 50 degrees, maybe 55. We want to wait till those bees have a chance to, like you said, exit that habitat where the stem or wherever they're overwintering. Another option is you can cut those stems and pile them in the back of the garden and just wait until the temperatures are nice and warm. So some people do it different ways, but yeah, I like to shoot for daytime temperatures 50 to 55 degrees on a consistent basis. That's kind of what I like.
Yeah. Okay. The next two are going to be more technical, broad spectrum. So you talked about the bumblebees. So how does the queen restart the new colony if she lays fertile eggs? But how do the larvae get fed? How does she do it when it's still by herself?
Yeah, and that's a good question. We talked about bumblebees are unique in the sense they need 3 different types of habitat. They need the food, they need the nesting material, nesting habitat during the season. They need overwintering. The queen needs overwintering habitat because the queen is going to be the one collecting that initial food resource for that initial group of larvae. So the queen is going to be out actually foraging in the spring. That is why we need some of these early spring bloomers to be able to, a bumblebee colony may not be able to get established if the queen can't find enough food, floral, pollen, and nectar resources early on. So we didn't get to one of the plants like willows. There's some also trees. There's some trees and shrubs we can utilize that provide early spring foraging for bumblebees. And so you may do some research on that to determine specific plants that are good for that queen as she's starting that new colony.
I tell you what, she's a busy gal, isn't she?
Yeah.
Okay. The next one's another one of these kind of broad scoping questions. So if we talk about earlier about we leave all this debris in the stem for the overwintering stages. So when we burn the prairie, don't we kill those off?
Well, that's true. You think about the bees that are in those stems, a lot of times that cycle of burning is definitely going to cause that to happen. Yeah, you're going to have losses. And I've read, there's recommendations you can find on how to go about still burning and removing that debris, from a prairie ecosystem. A lot of times you'll read recommendations that say burn 1/3 of it at a time or do a selective burn so that you're not burning the whole thing all at once. That sometimes can be critical in pollinator habitat. So like Dennis said, you're not losing all the bees all at once, right? So you want to have some plan about that. Yeah.
Okay, I answered this one, but since we have time, I'll go ahead and have you answer again. So if I walk into a nursery garden center, how do I know if I'm getting a nativar, I'm getting the true native, the straight species? Because you talked about the variations in flower structure and pollen qualities, maybe.
Right. And that is a great question. And honestly, it's not an easy one to answer because every plant is bred differently for different reasons and selected for different traits. And so what I tell people is you really have to do your research like ahead of time, determine the plant that you're looking for. You probably can't make an on the spot decision. You may have to have some familiarity with the species of that plant to know what it looks like and how it functions. And then look at the cultivated variety and see how much different it actually looks. So compare and contrast the two. Like we said, the species of Echinacea has that single set of, flower with the cone. Whereas, the ones that have been bred that have that double flower look a lot different and are not as attractive to pollinators. So if you can look at the differences, that may be the best. And if all else fails, resort and use just the original species and find that.
The way I answer it is sometimes if they have another name, like a cute name or something, more than if it's just a straight species, they're just a common name. So you've created some interest with herbs as pollinating plants. So the question came is, well, if you let your herbs flower, most of them, it lowers the quality of the herb for culinary uses. So how do you balance that?
Right. And that may be a case where you just want to designate an area, maybe a strip in between rows in your garden just for pollinators. So some of these herbs you can seed out with seed early in the year and just let them go and just go to flower. Right. And some of the other herbs we may use for culinary, but, like you said, there is going to be some loss if we're trying to use those in the kitchen, but by letting them flower, some of those. I didn't highlight, there's a lot of our garden plants, our early spring greens, like our mustard family of plants, think of radishes, arugula. Some of those plants are wonderful pollinator plants when they go to bloom as well. So sometimes, we can get a dual use. We can plant our spring greens and then let those go to flower and support pollinators as well. So there's lots of ways, creative ways we can create habitat. We just got to think outside the box sometimes, but it's fun to do that.
Okay. I'm going to have your last question.
Yep.
So, are all bees pollinators? And the question had come about earlier, are Carpenter bees pollinators?
Okay.
So are all bees pollinators?
As far as I know, somebody may be able to prove me wrong on this, and I'm not an expert, but I generally, as from what I understand, the bees are pollinators because they need the pollen to reproduce in about every setting. There are certain bees that I know are parasitic, and they actually will, simply go into another bee's hive and nest in it. So I'm not sure about those parasitic bees, but in general, vastly, just generally speaking, they are, yes, because they're collecting pollen to reproduce. And in that process, they're pollinating plants. Yeah. Okay,
cool. Well, you have a plethora of questions. I think it's 1 o'clock. I'm going to turn it back over to Cassie, and
Thanks,
you can always contact your local office
right.
for more answers to questions.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jason. That was an awesome presentation. I loved all your pictures with the little bees on the flowers. Those were great photos. So I know we didn't make it through all the questions today, but any links that we sent over the chat related to the session will be on the website. So I'll have one of the moderators put our website in the chat. So once again, thank you for joining us for K-State Garden Hour, hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We are glad you're here today to learn about native plants and supporting native bees. We're going to start our fall series in August, so be sure to visit the K-State Garden Hour website to see those upcoming topics. This session was recorded and it will be posted on that website by tomorrow afternoon. And when the Zoom is over, you will get a prompt to take a survey, so please fill that out. We really appreciate your feedback. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu. So thanks again. Have a great week, everyone.